My father used the word disappointment exactly once, out loud, in front of witnesses. He said it at my younger brother's graduation party, in the backyard of the house I grew up in, to a man whose opinion he had been cultivating for 30 years. He didn't say it about me directly. He said it the way careful men say difficult things indirectly, deniably, wrapped inside a compliment for someone else. Dominic always knew what he wanted. Julian was the one we worried about. The man he was speaking to nodded politely. Neither of them knew I was standing on the other side of the garden hedge. Neither of them knew that the man they would spend the rest of that evening trying to impress had flown in that week from Geneva, specifically, because of a paper that had my name on the front page. What happened when Dr. Eris Thorne walked through my father's back door and understood what he was looking at, and what my father's face did the moment he understood what he had said within earshot of both of us, I had not planned to witness. I had only come back for the weekend because my mother asked me to. I had almost said no. The moment Dr. Thorne walked through the garden door and Garrick Vance understood what he'd said and who had heard it coming in this story. If you've ever been the child your family filed under, still figuring it out, while you were quietly building something that mattered, this one was made for you. Drop a comment below telling me which part found you. I read every single one. What I didn't know, standing on the other side of that hedge with my father's words still in the air, was that Dr. Thorne had not come to my brother's party to celebrate Dominic. He had come because the only name on his research agenda that weekend was mine, and he had just heard the man who raised me explain me away in 9 words, and his expression, when he finally turned and found me standing there, was not sympathy. It was something I had never once seen directed at me inside my father's house, recognition specific, earned, and completely impossible for Garrick Vance to dismiss. My name is Julian Vance, and the honest version of my childhood is this. I was loved. But I loved the way a family loves a child who has not yet resolved himself into something legible with warmth that carries, underneath it, the faint and persistent anxiety of people waiting for an outcome they could explain at dinner. My father, Garrick Vance, had built a career that required no explanation. Civil structural engineering, 26 years with the same firm. A professional identity so solid and load-bearing that it had become, in some way, the architectural model for what success was supposed to look like in our household. You chose a field with weight. You stayed. You rose. You became someone a stranger could describe in a sentence without losing the thread. My brother Dominic had understood this instinctively. He was younger by 4 years and moved through the family's categories of legible achievement with the ease of someone who had never been asked to question whether the categories fit. Medicine, the right school, the right specialty. My parents talked about Dominic's career the way they talked about weather as a fact of life, reliable, requiring no additional interpretation. I was the other version, not because I failed. I want to be precise about this, because the story I am going to tell you is not the story of a man who didn't try hard enough or couldn't find his footing. I tried. I found my footing. I simply found it in a direction my father's engineering mind had not built a framework to assess. I left the accountancy track at 29 to work in applied behavioral economics, specifically in policy design for public health systems in low-resource environments. It is difficult to explain at a dinner party. That difficulty, I came to understand, was the entirety of my father's objection. Not the work. Not the salary, which was modest but sufficient. Not the hours, which were brutal but chosen. The difficulty of explaining it. The way it required more than a sentence. The way it demanded that the listener already hold a working vocabulary before the description could begin. Garrick Vance was not a man who liked to ask for the vocabulary first. So he did what families do when they encounter an outcome that doesn't fit the available categories. He filed me under the closest approximation he had. Julian is still finding his way. Julian went a different route. Julian, and this was the one that reached me, years later, through a garden hedge on a Saturday afternoon in early June, was the one we worried about. I want to tell you what happened when that sentence met the man who had flown in from Geneva to find me. But first you need to understand what my father didn't know I'd been building for the past 11 years, and why his most distinguished guest had been carrying my name in his briefcase for the better part of a month. Stay with me. This is the story of what happens to the quiet work, and what happens to the family's story about it, the night someone who actually knows the difference walks through the door. The party had been running for 2 hours before I found a reason to step away from it. That was always how I managed these gatherings, not by leaving, but by finding the edges. The side of the garden where the noise softened. The stretch of hedge near the back fence where my father had planted laurel 20 years ago because he liked the privacy it gave him, and which had grown, in the intervening decades, thick enough to stand behind without being seen from the terrace. I wasn't hiding. I want to be honest about that. I was simply doing what I had learned to do in my family's house, occupying the space that required the least explanation. Dominic was on the terrace, easy and expansive, the way he always was when my father's colleagues were present. He had a particular gift for those rooms, the ability to make professional conversation feel personal, to make men like Garrick's guests feel that their attention was exactly the right place to direct it. I had watched him do it since we were children. I had never resented it. That surprised people when I admitted it. They expected sibling rivalry. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. The specific loneliness of watching someone occupy a space you were never offered. I heard my father's voice before I heard the words, that low, deliberate register he used when he wanted a conversation to sound like a considered opinion rather than a verdict. I had grown up calibrating my behavior against that register. 34 years of learning to read the difference between the tone that meant approval and the one that meant he was managing expectations about you in front of someone whose opinion he cared about. Dominic always knew what he wanted. Julian was the one we worried about. I stood very still. The laurel was between us. My father was perhaps 4 meters away, speaking to a man I had not yet seen clearly, tall, unhurried, the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have stopped needing to perform confidence, because they've had it long enough to forget it's unusual. My father continued. Something about paths. Something about the difficulty of the unconventional ones. The practiced warmth of a man who had spent 30 years framing difficult information as compassion. What I noticed, and I noticed it the way you notice the moment a temperature drops, not with drama but with the precise and physical certainty of something changing, was that the man he was speaking to had gone quiet. Not the polite quiet of a guest managing an awkward subject. A different quiet. The kind that follows recognition. He turned slightly. And for a moment, across the hedge and the early evening light, his eyes found mine. He didn't look away. And that was when I understood that whatever my father had just said, this particular man already knew something that made it very difficult to agree with. He walked around the hedge, not hurriedly. Not with the particular energy of someone who has witnessed something uncomfortable and feels obligated to address it. He walked the way people walk when they have decided something and are no longer in a hurry about it, measured, unhurried, with the quiet authority of a man who had stopped needing to announce himself in rooms a long time ago. My father was still speaking when Dr. Eris Thorne stepped around the laurel and found me standing there. Garrick Vance had the composure of a man who had managed difficult information in professional settings for 30 years. But there is a specific kind of composure that professional experience doesn't prepare you for, the kind required when you realize that the person you were just describing was close enough to have heard every word, and that the man you were performing your assessment for is now looking at that person with an expression that contradicts everything you just said. My father went quiet, not the controlled quiet of a man choosing his next sentence. The other kind. Dr. Thorne looked at me for a moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice had the texture of someone who had been holding a question for several weeks and had just located the person who could answer it. "Julian Vance," he said, Not a question. I am, I said. He nodded once, the way people nod when a piece of information slots into place that they have been trying to position for some time. I've been carrying your paper since April. The Resilience Index Framework. The third methodology is the cascading dependency model. He paused. I used it in Geneva. We've been building on it for 6 months. I was aware of my father standing 3 feet to my left. I was aware of the particular quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man recalibrating in real time, running the new information against the existing framework, and finding that the existing framework required significant revision. I did not look at him. I didn't know you'd be here, Dr. Thorne said. Your institutional affiliation doesn't list a home address. Something close to dry amusement crossed his face. Your father didn't mention the connection. Wouldn't have known, I said. That sentence landed the way I had not entirely intended it to land, accurate, quiet, and with the particular weight of 11 years of dinners where my work had been filed under things we don't need to go into tonight. Dr. Thorne looked at me a moment longer. Then he said, I'd like to talk properly. Not tonight, but this week if you're available. There's a research consortium that has been trying to locate the methodology's originator since February. He handed me a card. Cream, simple, the weight of paper that belongs to institutions that don't need to announce themselves. I took it. And then, for the first time since I had arrived at my brother's party, I allowed myself to look at my father. His face was doing something I did not yet have a name for. But it was new, and it was real, and it was the first honest thing I had seen on it in longer than I wanted to calculate. Dr. Thorne was absorbed back into the party within minutes of my mother appearing at the garden door, with the practiced timing of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring no guest stood alone for long. She guided him toward the terrace with a warmth that required no effort because it was, in its way, entirely genuine. My mother's hospitality was never performed. It was simply applied selectively to the people whose presence she had already categorized as mattering. I stayed where I was. My father did not move either. We stood on the grass with the laurel behind us and the sounds of Dominic's party carrying across the garden. And Garrick Vance looked at the card in my hand with an expression I had not seen him direct at anything associated with me in a very long time. It was not pride. I want to be precise about that, because the easy version of this moment would be pride, the father recalibrating in real time, the son finally legible, the family story correcting itself on a warm June evening. What it was closer to the expression of a man who has just discovered a measurement error in a calculation he submitted years ago and cannot yet determine how far the error runs. You didn't tell me, he said finally. You didn't ask, I said. He absorbed that the way he absorbed most uncomfortable truths without visible reaction, filing it somewhere internal for processing later, in private, where the conclusions wouldn't require. Dr. Thorne, he said. He's been on the WHO advisory panel. The resilience work out of Geneva, I've read summaries of it. He stopped. The implication arrived without requiring completion. Framework has my name on it, I said, not aggressively. As a fact. The kind of fact that had simply existed, documented and unannounced for the better part of 2 years. Garrick looked at me then fully, in the way he looked at structural problems. Not with warmth, but with the specific attention of a man trying to understand load-bearing capacity he had previously underestimated. Long, he started. 11 years, I said. He went quiet again. And in that quiet I became aware of something I had not accounted for, that telling the truth inside this garden after 11 years of the alternative had a physical quality to it. Not relief, something less comfortable than relief. The specific vertigo of a person who has been compensating for an absence so long that they have built their entire posture around it, and have just been asked, without warning, to stand straight. From the terrace, I heard Dominic's laugh carry across the garden. Easy, unaware, perfectly situated in the only version of this family's story he had ever been asked to hold. I slid the card into my jacket pocket. And for the first time in as long as I could honestly remember, I did not make it easy for my father to find the next sentence. I let the silence be his to carry. The rest of the party passed the way difficult evenings pass when you have decided to stay inside them rather than leave slowly, with the particular texture of a person managing their own presence in a room that no longer feels neutral. I watched my father re-enter the terrace. He found his composure within seconds, the way he always did, not because the moment hadn't registered, but because Garrick Vance had spent a career believing that the visible management of information was itself a form of strength. He moved back into the current of his own gathering with the practiced ease of a man who intended to think about what had just happened, but not here, and not yet. Dominic found me near the drinks table an hour later. He was in the easy, expansive mood that success produced in him, not cruelty, not calculation, just the particular brightness of a man who had spent the evening being celebrated and still had enough warmth left over to offer some outward. He handed me a glass without being asked. "Good of you to come," he said, and he meant it. That was the complicated thing about Dominic. The warmth was always real. It simply existed at a surface level that had never required him to look down. "Congratulations," I said. "On the position." He nodded, accepting it comfortably. Then, with the curiosity of someone who had noticed something without quite processing its significance, "What were you and Dad talking about? In the garden?" "Work," I said. Dominic absorbed this with a small smile that held beneath it the faintest trace of something he would not have named as relief, but functioned exactly like it. Work in our family's vocabulary had always been his territory, the legible kind, the kind that required no translation. The idea of my work entering the same conversation had never previously required him to adjust anything. "Dad said Thorne seemed to know you," Dominic said carefully. "We share a research area," I said. Another pause. The smile remained, but the texture behind it had shifted slightly, the specific recalibration of someone who has just registered that a room they believed they understood has a door they didn't know was there. "You should have said something," he said finally, lightly, almost as a suggestion. "About the work. Mum would have what?" I asked. "What would she have done, Dom?" He didn't answer. Not because he was unkind, but because the honest answer required him to examine something he had spent years living comfortably beside without examining. And that examination was not something a graduation party, on a warm June evening, in our parents' garden, was equipped to hold. He touched my shoulder briefly, the gesture of a brother who cared and didn't know how to convert that care into anything the moment required, and drifted back toward his guests. I set down my glass. Somewhere inside the house, I could hear my father's voice. He was on the phone. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the tone immediately, the one he reserved for conversations he considered important. The question that arrived, quietly and without drama, was simply this: who was he calling, and what had the last 2 hours given him reason to say? I drove back to my flat that night with the particular emptiness of a person who has held themselves together through an evening that required it, and is now, alone in a car on a dark motorway, no longer required to hold anything. The card was on the passenger seat. I didn't look at it. I knew it was there the way you know about a fact you're not yet ready to fully process peripherally, carefully, with the specific discipline of someone who has learned that some things need to be approached on a schedule your emotions agree to in advance. My phone lit up twice before I reached the motorway. Both times, my mother. I let both calls go. She left a voicemail on the second. I didn't listen to it that night. I knew, without needing to hear it, the approximate shape of what it contained was something warm, something careful, something designed to cover the distance between what had happened in the garden and the version of the evening she intended to carry forward. My mother was extraordinarily skilled at that kind of coverage. She had been practicing it for as long as I could remember. The revision of difficult moments into manageable ones, delivered with enough genuine affection that challenging the revision felt ungrateful rather than accurate. That was the thing nobody outside the family ever quite understood. It was never cold in our house. It was never deliberately unkind. The damage, when it came, arrived wrapped in warmth in my father's measured concern, my mother's careful reframings, Dominic's easy, unexamined brightness. You couldn't point to a wound and name the instrument cleanly. You could only describe the slow, cumulative effect of being loved in a language that had no vocabulary for what you actually were. I pulled off at a service station. Not because I needed anything, because I needed the car to be still. I sat for a while with the engine off and the orange forecourt light falling through the windscreen and thought about what Dr. Thorne had said. Not the professional weight of it. I had built enough distance from needing external validation to receive that part without being destabilized. What I kept returning to was smaller and harder to organize. The specific expression on my father's face in the seconds before he recovered. The way the measurement error had registered not as guilt, not as shame, but as the genuine, disorienting confusion of a man who had believed his own accounting for so long that the correction felt like an anomaly rather than a reckoning. He had not been lying about me. That was the part I had spent years failing to adequately explain to myself. He had simply never looked closely enough to be accurate. I picked up my phone, opened the voicemail, listened. My mother's voice was even, warm, and entirely focused on one thing, whether I might come for dinner the following Sunday. Just the four of us. Nothing formal. She did not mention Dr. Thorne. She did not mention the garden. She did not mention what my father had said within earshot of both of us and a man whose opinion he had been cultivating for 30 years. She asked about Sunday as though the evening had been entirely ordinary. And I understood, sitting in that forecourt with the engine off, that I had a choice to make not about Sunday, but about whether I was still willing to help my family maintain the fiction that nothing had shifted. Whether I would walk back into that dining room and occupy the old position, smaller and quieter and easier to explain, because it was what the room had always required. I had been making that choice for 11 years. I was no longer certain I was willing to make it again. I went to Sunday dinner. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't an obligation, though obligation was the word my mother would have used if I'd declined. It wasn't the hope that something would be different. I had spent enough years in therapy to recognize that particular form of self-deception. I went because I had made a decision in a service station forecourt at 11:30 on a Friday night, and I needed to find out whether I was actually capable of keeping it. The house looked the same. It always looked the same. That was one of the things about my parents' home that I had come to understand was not accidental. The unchanging quality of it, the careful preservation of every surface, was itself a form of argument. This is what endures. This is what was correctly built. Everything inside these walls was selected and maintained as evidence of a life that had proceeded according to plan. My mother had made the kind of lunch that communicated effort without announcing it. Good china. Flowers on the table that she would say she'd had in the house anyway. Dominic wasn't there for a prior commitment she'd mentioned on the phone without elaborating. I noted the absence the way you note the removal of a buffer. My father was in the sitting room when I arrived. He stood when I came in, which he didn't always do, and something in that small adjustment told me the week had not passed neutrally for him. We sat down to eat. My mother carried the conversation for the first 20 minutes with the skill of a woman who had been doing exactly this, papering silence with warmth, filling the gaps before they could become questions for the entirety of her married life. The garden, Dominic's new flat in Edinburgh, a neighbor's planning dispute that had apparently divided the street with unusual passion. My father ate and said little. Strange, I thought. He was a man who used silence as an authority tool, deployed deliberately. This was different. This was the silence of someone who had not yet decided what to say, and, for perhaps the first time I could recall, was unwilling to speak before he had. It was my mother who finally crossed the distance. Between the main course and whatever came after, she set down her fork with the specific precision of a woman setting down something heavier than cutlery. "Doctor, Thorne called your father," she said, evenly, as a fact being placed on the table for examination rather than a confession. I looked at her. Then my father, Garrick Vance, met my eyes with the expression of a man who had spent a week preparing for a conversation and had just been relieved of the decision about when to begin it. "He's putting together a consortium," my father said carefully. "He wanted to discuss your involvement. He called here because he didn't have another number." Room was very quiet. "He asked me," my father continued, in a voice that had lost its usual structural certainty, "how long you'd been doing this kind of work." He paused. I told him I wasn't sure I knew the full answer to that. I had waited 11 years for my father to admit he didn't know something about me. I had not expected it to feel like this, not triumphant, not relieving. Something more complicated and less comfortable than either the specific disorientation of a person who has organized their entire emotional architecture around an absence, and has just been handed the thing they stopped asking for so long ago that receiving it no longer feels the way they imagined it would. My mother was watching me with the careful attention she reserved for moments she couldn't yet categorize. She wanted to know which way this would go. Whether I would make it easy, offer my father the graceful exit, redirect the conversation, perform the familiar generosity of a son who had learned to manage his own disappointment quietly so the room could stay comfortable. I had done it 40 times. I picked up my glass, set it back down. 11 years, I said. "That's the answer if he calls again." My father nodded once. Something in his jaw shifted, not emotion exactly, but the physical register of a man absorbing a correction he cannot dispute and is not certain, yet, how to carry. My mother said my name. Softly, with the particular inflection that meant she was asking me to remember that this was still the family table, that there were still boundaries around how much truth the room was equipped to hold at once. The strange part was that I didn't feel angry. I had expected anger had assumed, in the rare moments I'd let myself imagine this conversation, that the accumulated weight of 11 years would arrive with heat. What I felt instead was something quieter and more permanent. The specific clarity of a person who has finally stopped translating themselves into a language that was never going to fit. "I'm meeting with the consortium on Thursday," I said. "In London. I thought you should know." My father looked at me. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," I said. "About the work, what it is, what it does, where it's going." I paused. "The same things I would have told you if you'd asked." That last sentence landed in the room the way I had not entirely planned, not as an accusation, but with the weight of one. Accurate and unavoidable, and carrying the particular silence that follows when something true has been said in a room that has spent years successfully preventing it. My mother looked at her plate. My father said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful quality of a man choosing words with the awareness that the wrong ones would not be retrievable. "Like to understand it," he said. "The work, properly, if you're willing." 4 words from a man who had spent 11 years not asking. I looked at him across the table, this precise, status-conscious, deeply incurious man who had filed me under the wrong category for a decade, and was now, at 71, attempting something I was not certain his habits would allow him to complete. I didn't say yes immediately. I let him sit with the question the way I had sat with its absence for 11 years. Then I said, "I'll think about it." And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I drove away from that house without performing the smaller version of myself on the way out. What came next, what Thursday produced, and what my father did with what I finally chose to give him is the part of the story that cost the most to tell, and the only part in the end that truly mattered. Thursday arrived the way significant days often do, quietly, without the ceremony the occasion seemed to deserve, the morning indistinguishable from any other, except for the specific weight that had settled somewhere behind the sternum, since the previous Sunday. I took the early train to London. I had prepared for the consortium meeting the way I prepared for everything thoroughly, without announcing the preparation to anyone who might interpret it as anxiety. The documentation was ordered. The methodology summaries were clean. I had anticipated the questions a room of serious people would ask, and had built honest answers for all of them, including the ones that required me to say I don't know, yet rather than the confident projection those rooms often preferred. What I had not prepared for was the message from my father that arrived as the train cleared the outskirts of the city. It was brief. Garrick Vance did not write long messages. He considered them imprecise, a spilling of intention that careful people learned to contain. This one had 4 lines. I pulled the WHO Resilience Report from 2023. Your framework is in the methodology appendix. I had read the report when it was published. I didn't make the connection. I'm not sure what to do with that. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table beside my coffee and watched the countryside move past the window for a long time. He had read the report. He had held the evidence of my work in his hands, in the year it was published, and had not known to look for my name in it. That was the fact he was sitting with, not guilt, not shame, but the precise and vertiginous discovery of a man who had believed his own map of his son and had just found a significant territory marked incorrectly on it. The strange part was not the message. It was that he sent it at all. My father was not a man who shared his unresolved reckonings. He processed privately and emerged with conclusions tidy, considered, delivered with the authority of someone who had already done the internal work before bringing the results to the room. The fact that he had sent something unfinished, something that explicitly admitted he didn't know what to do, was a departure from every communicative habit he had built across 71 years. I didn't reply before the meeting. The consortium was everything Dr. Thorne had described: serious, substantive, conduct entirely in the vocabulary of people who understood the work from the inside. For 3 hours I spoke about the methodology without editing it, without finding the simpler version, without monitoring the room for signs that the explanation had exceeded the available patience. They asked good questions. I gave accurate answers. At one point, a woman across the table said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone confirming a thing already known, that the cascading dependency model was the most practically deployable framework her team had encountered in a decade. I received it without deflecting. That was new. On the train home, I picked up my phone. My father's message was still there, still unresolved. The 4 lines of a man reaching across 11 years of incuriosity with the only tool his habits had left him: honesty about his own confusion, offered without packaging, without resolution, without the usual armature of authority that made his communications feel complete. I thought about what it had cost him to send it unfinished. I thought about what it would cost me to answer it honestly. Then I typed. The connection was always there. You would have found it earlier if you'd known to look. I'm willing to help you look now if that's what you're asking. I sent it before I could find a reason to make it smaller. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. He was typing. For a man who processed privately and emerged with conclusions, the speed of it meant something. I watched the dots for a long time. They appeared and disappeared twice the specific rhythm of someone writing something, reconsidering, writing again. Whatever he was trying to say, it was costing him the effort of finding language for a room he had never learned to enter. And he was trying anyway. His reply came through as the train pulled into the station. Not long. Not eloquent. Nothing that would read, to an outside eye, as the significant thing it was. I'd like that. Sunday, if you're willing. Just the 2 of us this time. I sat with those 12 words on a platform filled with commuters moving in every direction with the efficient purposefulness of people who knew exactly where they were going. I was, for a moment, entirely still inside all of that motion. Just the 2 of us this time. My father had never once, in my adult life, requested my company specifically. Dinners were family occasions. My mother's architecture, her guest list, her careful arrangement of the people and the atmosphere and the subjects that would and would not be visited. Garrick Vance showed up to those structures as their natural authority, their organizing weight. He had never built one himself with me as the intended occupant. I typed back, "Sunday works, nothing more." He didn't need more, and I had learned, somewhere in the previous week, that I was done offering elaboration to fill silences that were not mine to fill. I called Dr. Thorne from the car park outside the station. He answered on the second ring with the unhurried quality of a man who had been expecting the call. "It went well," I said. "I know," he said. "Sarah messaged me an hour ago. She used the word extraordinary, which she applies to approximately 4 things per decade." A brief pause. "How do you feel?" It was not the kind of question I was typically asked by professional contacts, but Thorne had a way of asking it that made it feel less like an intrusion and more like a form of precision, an accurate instrument checking that the person attached to the work was still structurally sound. "Honestly," I said, "like I've been carrying a piece of furniture through a narrow doorway for 11 years and someone has just widened the door." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to require some adjustment," I said. "It is." We spoke for 10 minutes about the consortium's next steps, the formalization of the framework, the documentation that would carry my name on its cover page rather than in an appendix, the specific, undramatic machinery of work being properly attributed to its origin. After I ended the call, I stood in the car park for a while longer than was necessary. Here is what I understood, standing there in the early evening with the city settling around me into its quieter register. The meeting had not changed what the work was. The work had always been what it was documented, applied, built upon by people in rooms my family had never visited. The consortium had not created its value. They had simply confirmed what had existed in the absence of their confirmation. That distinction mattered more than I had expected it to. Because the thing I had needed to repair was never the professional record. It was the habit I had built around protecting myself from wanting more than the professional record, the careful, practiced self-sufficiency that had kept me functional and also kept me, in some fundamental way, smaller than the life I had actually constructed. I got in the car, on the passenger seat, where Dr. Thorne's card had rested 6 days ago. There was nothing. I had transferred the card to my desk at home, slotted into the corner of my monitor, where I kept things that required action rather than just thought. I drove home through the familiar streets and thought about Sunday, about what it meant to sit across a table from my father with no buffer, no occasion, no social architecture my mother had built to manage the shape of the conversation. Just Garrick Vance and the son he had spent 11 years filing under the wrong category, and the particular, unscripted difficulty of 2 people trying to find a language they had never been given a reason to develop. I didn't know if he was capable of it. I wasn't entirely certain I was either, but he had asked. Without packaging, without the armature of a family occasion to make the asking feel incidental, he had asked for me specifically. And that was something I had not previously had to decide what to do with. Sunday came with the particular quietness of a morning that knows it carries more than the calendar suggests. I arrived at 9. My father had said 9, which was itself unusual. Garrick Vance operated on the architecture of formal mealtimes, the structured hospitality of a man who understood gatherings as occasions. 9 in the morning was not an occasion. It was something more unguarded than that. Something closer to an honest hour. My mother was not there. He had arranged that too. I understood not with manipulation, but with the specific intentionality of a man who had decided that what needed to happen could not happen inside the usual structure. Her absence was the most deliberate thing he had done in my direction in 11 years. He opened the door himself. No jacket. A Sunday morning version of my father that I had seen 1,000 times as a child, and had somehow, over the distance of adult years, stopped expecting to find. He looked, without the professional register, older, more uncertain, More human. Come in, he said. Coffee's on. The kitchen was warm. Morning light across the same table where the previous Sunday's lunch had rearranged something between us without either of us yet knowing its full extent. He poured 2 cups with the focused attention he brought to small tasks, the precise, unhurried movements of a man who respected the ordinary mechanics of things. We sat down. He had the 2023 WHO report on the table. Physical copy, printed and bound, the methodology appendix open with 3 passages marked in pencil. Careful marks. The handwriting of a man who had been reading seriously rather than searching for confirmation of something he already believed. I looked at it without speaking. Been going through it, he said. Since Wednesday, I had to look up several terms. He said this without embarrassment, which cost him something. I could see it cost him something. I understand the architecture of it now. Broadly. The dependency mapping. He paused. It's not unlike load distribution modeling in principle. He was translating my work into his vocabulary, not to diminish it, to reach it. Something shifted in my chest that I did not immediately have a name for. That's actually how I first conceptualized it, I said carefully. The structural engineering parallel, stress distribution across interconnected systems. He looked up. Something in his eyes sharpened the specific attention of a man who had found an unexpected point of entry into a room he thought was closed to him. You never mentioned that, he said. You never asked, I said, not an accusation this time. Just the plain, unadorned fact of it, laid between us without heat, without the weight it had carried at the lunch table the previous week. We were past the accusation phase. We were in something more unfamiliar and more difficult, the territory of 2 people attempting to cross a distance neither of them had originally chosen to create. He nodded slowly. I looked back at the report. Bridged resilience model, he said. The 3rd methodology. Walk me through it. 4 words I had waited 11 years to hear arranged in that particular order. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. I looked at my father across the table he had sat at for 40 years. This precise, status-conscious, structurally minded man who had needed a stranger from Geneva to tell him where to look, and I began. I did not use the simplified version. I used the real one. And he leaned forward, and he listened, and he asked questions, and when he didn't understand something he said so without the usual performance of authority that had always made the admission of not knowing feel, in his presence, like a form of defeat. We sat there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At no point did he look at his watch. That was how I knew something had genuinely changed. Not the questions, not the effort, not even the pencil marks in the margin of a report he had read 3 years ago without knowing to look for my name. It was the watch. Garrick Vance had worn the same watch for 30 years and had never, in any conversation I could recall, forgotten it was on his wrist. That morning, he forgot entirely. And in the particular, quiet grammar of a man like my father, that was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to receive. It was, I found unexpectedly, and with the specific relief of a weight finally set down enough. The weeks after that Sunday had a different quality to them, not transformed. I want to be precise about that, because the clean version of this story would have everything shift at once, the family recalibrating in a single morning, the years of accumulated distance dissolving in 2 hours and 40 minutes over a kitchen table. That is the version the story seems to be building toward, and it is not the true one. What actually happened was quieter and less complete and more valuable for being both. My father called the following Wednesday. Not for a reason, no occasion, no information to convey, no structural purpose that would have justified the call inside his previous habits. He had read something. A policy brief from the Geneva Consortium's preliminary documentation, circulated ahead of the formal framework publication. My name was on the cover page. He had read it, he said, and there were 2 sections he wanted to understand more fully. We talked for 35 minutes. He asked imperfect questions. Questions that revealed the gap between his framework and mine, that required me to rebuild the context before the answer could land, that occasionally sent us down adjacent corridors of explanation before we found our way back to the original point. He did not pretend the gaps weren't there. He navigated them with the specific, quiet determination of a man who has decided that understanding something matters more than appearing to already understand it. That was new. That was, in the vocabulary of Garrick Vance, significant. The formal publication came 6 weeks later. The methodology documentation, the consortium's framework, my name on the front page above the institutional affiliation, and the acknowledgement section that listed, among others, Dr. Eris Thorne and the 3-year body of field application that had preceded the formalization. My father received a copy. I did not send it. The consortium's communications team distributed it broadly, and Garrick Vance was, through various professional networks, exactly the kind of recipient their list would include. He called me the afternoon it arrived. He read me a paragraph from the executive summary. Slowly, with the careful diction of a man who understood that the words deserved the pace. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It has your name," he said. "It does," I said. Another silence. Not the managed kind. The kind that belongs to people who are sitting with something real and have not yet found the words that are adequate to it, and have stopped pretending that inadequate words are better than honest silence. "I'm going to tell people," he said finally. "When they ask about you, I've been telling them something that was incomplete. I want to change that." He did not say he was sorry for 11 years. Garrick Vance was not built for that sentence, and we both understood it. And the understanding between us was itself a form of honesty more durable than an apology delivered in a language he didn't fully speak. What he said was that he was going to change what he said next. For a man who measured everything in forward motion in outcomes, in structures built to last, in the careful, load-bearing architecture of a life deliberately constructed, that was the most truthful thing he had left to offer. I received it as the thing it was. Here is what 11 years of building quietly taught me that the building itself could not. The work was never in danger. It existed, was documented, was applied, and was carried in a briefcase from Geneva by a man who had spent a month trying to find its author. It did not require my father's acknowledgement to be real. It was real before he read the report, before the consortium formalized it, before that Sunday morning when he forgot to check his watch. What was in danger was not the work. It was me. I had spent 11 years making myself manageable in rooms that required a smaller version, not because those rooms had the power to diminish me, but because I had decided, for protection, to do the shrinking preemptively. To occupy the narrow passage between conspicuous and invisible, because the passage felt safer than the risk of being fully seen and found wanting by the people whose opinion I had trained myself to stop needing, and had never actually stopped needing. The garden hedge changed that. Not because of what Dr. Thorne said, not because of what my father's face did in the seconds before he recovered, not because of the consortium or the cover page or the Wednesday phone calls that came after. It changed because I finally stopped helping the people I loved maintain a fiction I had made too comfortable to question. That is the lesson. It is not a tidy one. It does not arrive with ceremony or resolve everything it touches. My father and I are still, in certain rooms and on certain subjects, learning a language we should have built decades ago. My mother still occasionally reaches for the old framings before catching herself. Dominic and I have had 2 conversations since the party that were more honest than the previous 30 years combined, and both of them were incomplete, and both of them mattered. None of it is finished. But I am no longer performing the smaller version of myself in the rooms where it was once required. And the work, the 11 years of it, the methodology, the frameworks built in the hours my family spent not asking continues. Properly attributed, fully inhabited. In my own language, at full length, in every room I choose to enter. That is the outcome, not the vindication. Not the moment across the hedge or the watch forgotten on a Sunday morning wrist. The daily, ordinary, irreversible decision to take up the space the work actually earned. That decision is available to every person who is ever explained away in 4 words by someone who never bothered to read past the summary. It does not require their permission. It never did.